Welcome to an episode of BDQ Cast. I'm Kiramode, I'm not Kodamarin, and the reason I am on this cast is to talk about my decision-making process for the Denver Vault Tour. Now, this is a little late. It's been kind of on the back burner because right after that Vault Tour, we got to work on other content, and then on top of that, we just, between the next set coming out and other obligations, it just kind of got put on the back burner. But an episode that I was pressuring Kodamarin to do was the future proofing episode, and that one also got kind of pushed to the side. Now that was mostly due to the fact that it seemed a little bit how do we put it this way, like tinfoil hattish, the way I wanted to talk about future proofing collections. But now that an errata came and that the card pool is different, my general thought process for this looks a little bit less crazy. So let's just jump right into it. I have, as you can see on my screen, I have 4 decks that I chose, or that had somewhere between mild to legitimate consideration for the Vault Tour. And I'll go over my decision-making process for each one of them, and it relates very well to the episode we just put out on the podcast about future-proofing your collection, because I do really believe that getting power 5 or higher is going to matter going forward, and I want to make sure that the decks I choose have staying power themselves. So the first one here is Absent Herald, Pioneer of Gloomcourt. Now this is one that you've seen Kodamarin play on his stream. It is the one with the Maverick Witch of the Eye along with the Control the Weak, and you just loop it. Now if you saw him play it, one of the things you'll notice is that this deck isn't very good. Or at least it isn't very good at playing traditional Keyforge, and that's largely due to the Suspect Untamed side that you can see over here on the right. There just isn't a whole lot there. I mean, you got some nice tools like Regrowth and Nefty Seed. Those help you with your combo. And then the Mars list, if it hits right, can actually win you a game, but this isn't reliable. The only way you're going to win with this deck is with Witch of the Eye. Now, if you run through our 3 considerations that we put. So the first question is, can this deck get nerfed out of existence? And the answer is it could. If Control the Weak gets hit, this deck dies. So there isn't really a saving grace. Like if this doesn't have the combo, it's just not a good deck. So that is something to keep in mind. Now I don't think that the likelihood of Control the Weak getting nerfed is increasingly high, but it's something that is worth considering, right? Especially considering that I have no other qualified decks. If this is, like, say, the only deck I end up qualifying and then Control the Weak gets hit, it's going to feel pretty bad. Now let's go to consideration number 2. Is this deck in an overly favorable meta? And the answer to this is a very clear no. So this deck, where it runs into problems, is number 1, if people are too fast, it can just get blown out, right? Like if people are too fast and they don't let me draw my whole deck, I can't find all the combo pieces. The other way that this deck gets hurt is artifact control. Seed, Library of the Damned, and Key to Dis are pretty active cards as far as helping me achieve the board state necessary to get the Witch of the Eye lock off. And, going into the Denver meta, this is when library access, going twice was a very relevant thing. And, people were making sure they're packing artifact hate. So I don't want to have a situation where somebody uses Nexus on my Seed, or I don't want a situation where someone poltergeists my Library of the Damned. So that's a bad meta. And then also, if you're not on a combo, you're probably racing the combo. Like all the decks that I'd be up against are actually pretty bad matchups for this. What I've noticed about this deck is that, and part of the reason I thought about it for the Denver Vault Tour is that even if people have the answers to it, if they don't know it's coming, you can actually get away with more than you probably should. So that one in particular, you can actually get through the Swiss rounds without actually playing your main deck, which is really weird. So if I could just basically qualify with a different deck, then go into day 2 with the real deck here, then you can maybe have a situation where you just have to get 1 or 2 wins, and now the deck's in the top 16, and then it gets blown out by a racing deck or blown out by a deck with artifact control. But you never know, right? Then it's qualified, and then looking forward, a year from now, we could find ourselves in an ideal meta. And the ideal meta for this deck is very specific. The meta you want to be in is a meta where decks are very slow as far as achieving their win condition and don't have a lot of artifact hate. We're talking like heavy board control decks. That is your perfect matchup, because then I have enough time to draw my whole deck, and I know I can actually use all the artifacts I want to use and then guarantee that I get the lock. But then you get to consideration number 3. Will a better version of this deck exist a year from now? My thought is probably not. I mean, it's possible, but I mean, this deck relies on a Maverick, so they would have to just basically reprint an entirely different way to do a sort of lock into one house, which I think is unlikely. So as far as being able to project forward, this deck actually projects forward very well. I could end up in a meta that is very favorable to this deck, and I don't think this deck is very likely to get nerfed. And then on top of that, I don't think a better version of this deck's coming. Now, ultimately, why I decided against it is I still want to win the tournament, right? I don't think that this deck has much of an ability to do so unless I just get extremely hot with the combo and just run into perfect matchups. And on top of that, I don't have any decks qualified. To me, this is the deck you qualify once you already have 3 or 4 decks and you just want to have the extra deck for tech choice. Like if I already have 3 real decks, and then it's like, let me have this one combo deck, so on the off chance that the meta is very specifically tailored to this combo deck, I can whip out the combo deck and then win Worlds. That's the idea. But, you know, like I said, this is more token consideration. Okay, now let's jump into deck number 2. So, Banefully Brass Hon. This is another deck that you've seen Kodameron play on stream. This is a deck that has grown on me more and more over time. So the main thing I want to highlight is this Dis lineup right here, and in particular, Screaming Cave. So Screaming Cave is a card that is very much underlooked by a lot of the community. And the reason is that typically Dis will play as your support house the vast majority of the time, or somewhere in between support and burst, where your burst is a very control burst, not necessarily an amber burst. But it's very rare that Dis is your main house in a deck, so Screaming Cave looks like a not very good card. Now, in this deck, Dis is very much our main house. I mean, we're talking, you got 2 Snudges, you got 2 Toxins, you also have a Pit Demon, and then also Tentacus, which Tentacus is more of a support card, but it still has 5 strength. So it's very easy for me to build a nice lineup of Dis creatures, and then on top of that, I also have an Arise and 2 Shadow Selves. So you're going to have to get through the Shadow Selves to kill my Dis creatures, and even if you kill them, I can Arise. So the reason this is important is that once my Dis board gets built, it doesn't go away. Because you can have a situation where, like, let's say I have a Lash and 3 Dis creatures and a Screaming Cave. If I have no Dis cards in my hand, there's going to be diminishing returns as far as calling Dis over and over again, right? At some, normally you're not drawing cards. But what I can do is I can just say, I'm going to trigger Screaming Cave every single turn. And I don't really care about the cards I send back in my deck, because if I just keep redrawing 6 cards, I'm going to draw 1 or 2 discards on average. So what's going to end up happening is all the other discards in my deck, I'm just going to keep playing them. So I don't have diminishing returns. I can continuously play Dis. Moreover, because I'm filtering out all of the discards over time, I end up in situations where my hand is clumped with nothing but Brobnar or nothing but Shadows. So to give you an example, in that Vault Tour, I did play this during Swiss, and in a game that was very notable, my first turn was, I went first, and I played a Mighty Javelin out of Brobnar. Then I played Dis, and my Dis turn was, I think, like a Snudge, a Toxin, a Screaming Cave, and then maybe like a Charette or something. It was like 3 Dis creatures and a Screaming Cave. And from that point forward, I actually just only called Dis for the rest of the game except for 1 turn, because I just kept Screaming Cave. And Screaming Cave just kept drawing me new discards, and I could just keep playing, and then eventually he board wiped me, and I Arise and brought it back, and then eventually where it got really dirty was I picked up Library of the Damned. And what I was able to do with that is I just kept archiving away Shadows cards. So there was 1 turn where I played like 9 Shadows cards in 1 turn between the archive and just the random Shadows cards that ended up in my hand, and then I went back to Dis. Like, I think that game probably went like, 12 or 13 turns, and literally only 2 of those turns did I not call Dis, and that was because I had the turn 1 Screaming Cave. So that's really what makes this deck powerful, is that potential. But then also you have other nice stuff too. Like you have the Sting in a deck where I can snudge the Sting back to my hand if I really feel like it. I have cards like Sound the Horns and Brobnar with only 3 creatures, which means my Arise gets stronger. I also have 2 Gauntlet of Commands, which is nice. And then I have really good burst cards in Shadows. Like when the Shadows line up, when those all get clumped together, it's actually really good, and you end up gaining like 6 Amber in one turn quite frequently. So now let's run it through our list. So the first question is, can this deck be errated out of existence? The answer is a very clear no. There's no one card that you could point to that can reasonably be errated, so I feel pretty good on that. Then, is this deck in a favorable meta? I also think it's not in a very favorable meta. What really hurts this deck is while I have cards like Lash and Iron Obelisk to make your keys cost more, I don't actually have a way to mass reduce your Amber. So if somebody's on like 12 Amber, I actually can't do anything about it. All I can do is I can stall you. I can maybe Miasma you, I can maybe Charette you, I can maybe damage my own Brobnar guys to make the Iron Obelisk give me a little bit more value. But at the end of the day, if you have the Amber, I just don't have a lot of ways to take it away from you. So I need to make sure that I build my board, build it quickly, and I just keep applying pressure on your board and then reap whenever it's advantageous to. So if we were to move into a meta where it's not as race heavy, this deck does become a little bit better because I have such strong board control options. And then the last question is, will a better version of this deck exist? I think almost certainly not. There are definitely better board control options, but what I think makes this deck special is the double snudge. Double snudge is a very nice thing to have. Also having Arise with Screaming Cave to re-get the Arise back in your hand, that is very nice. And it also has the support options in Brobnar and Shadows to really put it together with the big Brobnar guys to kill dudes and the Shadow Selves to protect my discards. So the reason I didn't choose it is for the same reason I didn't choose the first deck, which is I didn't feel confident enough that this deck would be able to win the tournament. And that's still a big deal, right? Like, you know, the whole episode is the whole reason we did it was we said, look, if you're going to choose between 2 decks, you know, all things being equal, choose the deck that has a little bit more value going forward. I still want to win, right? So I felt like I had other deck options that were better options right now that I would want to qualify and have enough value going forward. So this is where this deck got cut. I mean, it was very close. I did legitimately think about for a while just playing this deck all the way through, but I stopped short. Maybe at the next fall tour that has Archon, I give this deck another look because I do really love this deck. Okay, so the next deck on the list is the Thrall the Mels Copper. This is a deck that's been referenced a couple times. We actually referenced it in the episode. So this is a deck that I did run during Swiss to get me a lot of wins. It is a very fine-tuned deck. So what this deck is, in a nutshell, you got 2 Doorsteps to Heaven over here, and then there's 3 Grabber Jammers, there's a Lash, there's 2 Charettes, there's an Arise to get your Charettes back, there's also double Sequus, and then on top of that you also have a Mind Warper. And then there's other nice little control tools, like you can sometimes get a Psychic Network to stick, Pandemonium can oftentimes stick, and also on top of that you have a Lash of Broken Dreams, a Library of the Damned to filter through your deck faster, and a Dominator Bauble, which Bauble can hit a Grabber Jammer or a Sequus to function as even more key control. And the way this works is you just capture people's Amber over and over again, force the game to be a board control game, and then once they board wipe you, you hit them with a Doorstep, game gets reset, and we're back to the board control game, and I'll just win that value of attrition over time. This deck works really, really well against racing decks. That is what this deck is built to beat. Where it has trouble is against board control decks. So if somebody is running a legitimate board control deck, like they have the Brobnar Sanctum combo, this deck is in serious pain. Because if you look at the deck, while there are nice creatures in here, a lot of 4s. You know, there just isn't a lot of ways in this deck to deal with guys that are 5 or bigger. And that's where this deck kind of falls apart, is if people just have big creatures, it just has trouble, you know? So running it through, you know, again, the same system, is there anything that can nerf this deck? And the answer is yes. I mean, you can hit a Doorstep, but I don't think Doorstep's going to get hit. So given that I don't think Doorstep is likely to be nerfed in any way, I think that this deck is pretty much errata proof. Then the next question is this deck in an overly favorable meta? And I think the answer is yes. Now, there is ways to interact with this, right? Like if you run a lot of board wipes, along with being able to race, you can hit this deck pretty hard. However, I do think that this deck would rather be in a racing deck meta than a board control meta. And, you know, during set 1 and possibly during set 2, we haven't seen enough of it yet. It's going to be a racing meta. So this deck is playing in the meta it wants to play, but, you know, that's not necessarily the end of the world. It could be that, you know, the metas go in cycles, and by the time that I need to call this deck up, that we just happen to be in another racing deck meta and I want it. So it is a deck I do want to have qualified going forward. Then the last consideration is, will a better version of this deck exist? And the answer to this is a very resounding yes. So as I mentioned in the podcast, when I saw the preview for Grump Buggy, it sort of was like the death sentence for this deck. I mean, I think this deck is great. It's just when I can have 15 guys that are 5 or more and Grump Buggy's on the board, it just means that like all your keys cost like +6 or 7 routinely. And if Doorstep gets reprinted or Too Much to Protect gets reprinted, of which both got reprinted, it's not that hard to envision a scenario where I could find a deck that has multiple copies of Grump Buggy while also having multiple copies of Doorstep and or Too Much to Protect, and it'll do the same stuff this deck does, only the creatures will be big enough that my opponent simply having 5 guys that are 5 or more, that doesn't kill my deck. So that is the biggest concern I had for this. So I was like, you know what? As much as I love this, maybe I sit on it. It could be that this deck is actually just a better Amber control deck than anything AOA has to offer, and I'm just, you know, premature panicking. But my thought is there's enough fear there that while this deck does seem to be the ideal choice for the event because it has value going forward, and I felt it was a very good choice to actually win the event, I did get scared off by thinking a better version of this deck will simply be available in a couple months. So I thought, okay, let me see my last option. So the last option here is the one I went with. It's Rapidly Wild Swish. It's the one that you saw me play in the top 8 and in the top 4. So this deck is another Amber control deck. Now, unlike Thrall, the one that we just saw, this one does not go as hard. It does have both a Doorstep and it has a Too Much to Protect. So it has that mass Amber loss. It also has ways to capture. So if you look at the Sanctum side in particular, you got the double Sequus over here, you got the double Frankus, and you got one of my favorite cards in Champion Tabris. What's nice about that is that gives me 5 different guys inside of one house that can take an Amber on demand. So it's very easy for me to build a Sanctum board where I have like a Frankus and 2 Sequises, and then you're at 8, and I say, okay, Frankus kills a guy, that takes away 1, I reap twice, that takes away 2 more, now you're down to 5, and we still are playing Keyforge, right? I can just stall the game. You also have things like Dust Runner, which you can throw on random Sanctum guys. Every now and again, you can Carlo Phantom. There are 4 artifacts here, so you can have them take away Amber. Murmook is very sneakily good. And then if people board wipe you, you just hit them with either the Too Much to Protect or the Doorstep, and you're back to square one. So like I said, it doesn't go as hard as Thrall on the Amber control, but it has a very strong enough amount that when I'm up against racing decks, I feel pretty good about my ability to slow them down. What makes this deck a little bit different, though, is it has the ability to race. So if you look at the Untamed side in particular, in the top 8 match, this is where you got to see, when you get like the Hunting Witch and the Flaxias and the Dust Pixies and the Nature's Call early, this deck can actually pump out a lot of Amber. I mean, the Sanctum side doesn't really do much in terms of getting Amber out quickly, and the Shadow side's kind of like a 50-50 on whether or not it can do so. But when you get the Untamed stuff early and in the right order, this deck can just go off and race. So I would only say that it really races, like truly races, like, I don't know, 15 to 20% of the time. But when you can race that percentage and also play the board control game as your primary style, it gives this deck a lot of versatility, and I really do enjoy playing it. So much like the other ones, let's run through what the considerations are. 1, could this deck get nerfed? I would say that the biggest thing that could get nerfed here is the double Nature's Call. There are plays with this deck where you use Nature's Call in conjunction with Hunting Witches and Dust Pixies and Flaxias to just get a million Amber. and probably key charge in the same turn to make sure you don't get baited too hard. That play goes away if Nature's Call gets changed. The errata that I would, if I were to errata Nature's Call, I would guess that they would do something like Nature's Call only works on opponent's creatures or something to prevent that. But this deck, most of the time, like I said, 15 to 20% of the time, it races, and the rest of the time, it's just playing the control game. And when it's playing the control game, I don't use Nature's Call on my own guys. I use Nature's Call on my opponent's guys. And so, you know, it takes away its ability to race, but that's fine. Like, the deck doesn't get hit too hard if that were to happen. And then there's really nothing else here that can realistically be errata in a way that actually hurts the deck. Then the second question is this deck in an overly favorable meta? I would say no. Like, there's a lot of ways you can interact with this deck, and I don't love being against racing decks. Like, I feel confident enough playing against a racing deck, but you know, this deck's kind of ideal matchup is more of just being up against a different Amber control deck, like Thrall the Mels Copper, where the board control just isn't as strong as the board control that is within this deck. And then the last question is there a clearly better version of this deck that's coming down the pipeline? That one, I don't know. I mean, I love this deck a lot. It has a lot of really good board control options. Much like Banefully Brass Hon, you have the double Shadow Self. You have double Nature's Call to bounce stuff to hand. And then the Sanctum lineup just has a lot of big bodies. So I don't know if there's necessarily going to be a better one. Like, the only way that I can imagine a strictly better version of this deck is if there's just power creep, which is possible. But as far as like being a safe bet, I felt like this is a very safe bet. I can't really see this deck getting too much better with subsequent sets. The meta is not overly favorable to this deck. I think this deck just happens to be a lot of really good cards that do good things. And then I don't think this deck is nerfable. And so with the other decks, I was able to point out very clear problems, right? Thrall the Mels Copper, I just think a better version is coming down the line. And then the other two, Banefully Brass Hon and Absent Herald Pioneer of Gloomcourt, both of those decks I don't feel confident can win the event, whereas Rapidly Wild Swish, I think it can win the event. I think it has a lot of value going forward, and I felt like it was the safest bet to be my first deck that I qualify, because you never know, right? Right now I intend on going to a lot of Vault Tours, but life can get in the way, or maybe I just lose in subsequent Vault Tours. And what if, you know, when it's time to call up a deck for service, I only have like one or two? I'd feel a lot better if I have this be my one deck than one of the other three options that were there. So that's really all there is to it. When I was deciding my decks, I ran through this sort of system, and these were the 4 decks that I thought had a realistic chance at being played at the Vault Tour. And I went with the one that I felt was the best option, and I did really well. And I think there was a route where I could have actually won that event, whereas if I play the other decks, I'm not sure that that route still exists in the same way. So yeah, that's all there is to it. I'm Kiramode. Thank you for watching this cast, and we'll see you next time.